Final Fantasy VIII, a game I truly love for how weird and different it is. However, it doesn't seem to get the love from Square Enix that other Final Fantasy games get. No 25th anniversary celebration, no new merch, not even a special logo, unlike 7 and 9, which are greatly celebrated. And as much as I would love to see 8 get a remake, it doesn't look like that will ever happen. So we're gonna take a look at that in today's video and break those things down. If any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, subscribe, and let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Doing just one of those things helps out a ton, and it's always greatly appreciated. Alright, so some of you might be wondering, why talk about Final Fantasy VIII now, Corduroy? Why talk about a remake that you'll want to see that will never happen? Well, there was an interview done a while back with The Gamer where they sat down with Yoshinori Kitase and Naoki Hamaguchi to talk about the 7 Remake trilogy. They veered off subject and talked about the possibility of other Final Fantasies getting remakes, specifically 8. And this has been living in my head rent-free, and I gotta get it out. And we start off first with Naoki Hamaguchi, who was asked, would he ever work on another big Final Fantasy remake? He goes on to say, if after we finish the 3 games in the remake trilogy, Mr. Kitase then comes to me and says, right, we're going to be remaking another numbered Final Fantasy game and you are on the project, I'll just turn around and go, no. Which, look, sounds harsh, but I completely understand where Hamaguchi-san is coming from. This is a guy who is currently directing Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, which is probably going to be the biggest entry in that trilogy. He got the director responsibilities on Rebirth, and he was co-director on 7 Remake. And this project in particular has existed since the early 2010s. Hell, Nomura was conceptualizing this stuff during Advent Children. And in previous interviews, Kitase had mentioned that in the early 2010s, he approached Kazushige Nojima and said, it looks like we might be doing this remake. Could you potentially write some stuff for us so we have something to go off of? And that was early 2010s. And by the time this trilogy finishes, it'll be potentially 2027. So you're looking at 15 plus years of your life working on the same project. Final Fantasy VII Remake, day in and day out, eat, sleep, breathe, nothing but this project. So based on that, it doesn't sound like Hamaguchi would want to be involved in another massive big scale Final Fantasy remake a la 8, which sucks, but maybe they could find someone else. And that doesn't mean Hamaguchi will never work on Final Fantasy again. I could totally see him and CS1 leading a new mainline Final Fantasy, or perhaps creating a new IP at Square Enix that could be really great. And as much as I love the work that they've done with this trilogy, I'm super curious to see what he and CS1 could do with an original IP, their own characters, their own world, a story that they can craft from the very beginning without having to stick to any source materials. I think they could do some really cool stuff. So what about Kitase? If they were to remake 8, what would he like to see done? Because the game does need some TLC in some spots. Kitase would go on to talk about some of the changes he thinks would be necessary for a remake of 8. He would say, I think you may remember we had the junction system in 8. I think it was a very difficult system for some people to get into, so I think I'd want to return to that and really rework the battle system and make it something where the level of difficulty and approachability for some fans was a lot better balanced. He's 100% right there. The junction system in 8 is a pretty controversial system in that game. I think for most Final Fantasies, a lot of people are kind of mixed on how they feel about it. Personally, I think the actual junction system itself, where you're equipping different abilities, you're taking spells and putting them on your stats, I feel that is fairly simple and straightforward, especially by today's standards, where a lot of games have even more complex systems on systems and menus within menus. There are games where you've got skill trees that create new skill trees. I remember playing Call of Duty. I think it was one of the newer Modern Warfare releases, and I hadn't played Call of Duty in a long time. And I just wanted to accessorize my gun. And I'm going in there and I'm trying to do it the way I did it in the older games. And there are menus upon menus upon menus for your attachments. Attachments have attachments. It was pretty overwhelming and insane. Granted, that's Call of Duty, that's a completely different game, but you understand, a lot of systems these days are much more complex. So I think by today's standards, the junction system is very straightforward. Hey, I want to increase my health, I'm going to take Tornado and throw it on my HP, boom, massive boost. I want to increase my strength, I'm going to take that spell and put it on there. Do I want to do some nasty status effects? I'm going to take Pain and I'm going to put that on my weapon. So that way whenever I attack, I have a chance of inflicting bio, blindness, silence, what have you. Fairly simple, and it was pretty customizable, allowing the player to choose, do I want this character to use magic? Do I want them to use guardian forces? Do I want them to use items, or do I want them to focus on drawing magic? You could even throw in other abilities, like the recovery ability, which restored all of your HP, or the card ability, which allowed you to take enemies and turn them into cards. There was a lot of freedom of expression there, I felt, when it came to crafting those characters in their movesets and what you wanted them to do. But the part that I think a lot of people don't like, and even to this day is pretty tedious, is how you get to that junction system. And what do I mean by that? I mean acquiring spells. It was a bit of a pain in the butt. Now, there were some spots around the maps and the different locations where you had draw points, where you could run up to them, they would have certain spells, and you could draw those spells for whatever person was in your party. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, I loved it. But for the most part, earlier on in the game, if there was a specific spell you wanted, you had to go to the right area, you had to track down the right enemy, and then you had to spend a pretty decent amount of time drawing that specific spell from that enemy for all of your characters. Which was made even more tedious because you didn't always draw the set amount of spells from an enemy. Sometimes you would draw 9 spells from an enemy. Sometimes it would be 4. It was never really consistent. So really building that library of spells to then use in the junction system, I think, is what a lot of people have issues with. And then there was the whole fear of, okay, I've got 100 of a spell, I'm now going to put it on a stat. Can I no longer use that spell because the more I use the spell, I lose that stat? I was never quite sure if that was the case. I always assumed it was. So if I had Tornado, for example, on my HP, I would never cast Tornado for fear of it lowering my health. But what was really nice is that the further you got into the game and the more guardian forces you acquired, you could get abilities that would make getting spells so much easier. There was abilities that would let you take items and refine them into magic. You could take cards and refine them into magic. So it made accessing higher level spells or getting larger amounts of those spells way easier. So if you were to ever remake Final Fantasy VIII, I think you would have to rebalance and reconfigure that entire junction system, specifically with how you acquire things. So maybe just giving people that ability to refine items and cards and whatnot, or even some of your spells into stronger spells a little bit earlier on might be a cool solution for that. Now you're probably wondering, well, based on these words, it doesn't sound like they would never touch Final Fantasy VIII. True, but there is an article that was released a long time ago, and you'll have to forgive me, I haven't been able to track it down since, but it was an interview with someone who worked on Final Fantasy VIII. It may have even been Katase, but they were asked about the possibility of, hey, would you guys ever make a remake of Final Fantasy VIII? And that person just flat out said, it would have to be up to the next generation. We love it, but there's no way we can do it. And again, they've got their hands full with the 7 Remake trilogy. That entire process, super draining. I don't think they want to repeat that. But he essentially said, yeah, it's going to be up to the next generation of developers to take over a Final Fantasy VIII remake should it ever happen. And it doesn't seem like that's ever going to happen, unfortunately. But if you were to remake it, how would you do it? Again, it won't happen, but I really would love to see it on the scale of Final Fantasy VIII. 8 is such a cool game because it's got such a hodgepodge of different locations. There are locations that really feel like they're from the past, there are locations that feel like they're present day, and there are locations that feel super futuristic. So seeing that done in a modern graphical setting, I think could be super sick. I even saw this really cool image on Instagram. This was posted by Unalesca Games. I don't know the artist who did it or created the CG render, but it's a render of Squall done with the graphical style of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it looks really good. So to see that cast, that world, with the graphical fidelity we have nowadays, it's just super appealing. And of course, I really love the combat in the 7 Remake trilogy. I've said this so much, but I really would love to see them use that as the main combat system for mainline Final Fantasies moving forward. It's an incredibly sound combat system that lays a really great foundation for other developers to hop on board and add their own flair to it, making adjustments where needed, adding cool new systems. And it also creates a gameplay identity for the average game player to identify with Final Fantasy. Like for me, I'm totally cool with them doing different combat systems with each Final Fantasy. I think that's what keeps it unique. But maybe for the average person who wants a gameplay identity to latch onto, you can just take that one and just have these different devs come on board, add their own stamp, reiterate, and use that for, multiple games because it's really, really good. The other option, and this one might be more realistic of an option, and that's to go the Final Fantasy IX Remake route. Now again, we don't really know much about the 9 Remake other than it's somewhere in between Crisis Core Reunion's remaster and the 7 Remake trilogy in terms of its ambition and scale. So I would assume it would be along the lines of new graphics, voice acting, redone music, maybe adding some story stuff here and there, but keeping the core mechanics of gameplay the exact same. And Final Fantasy IX is a massive, massive game. I don't think you could remake that game on the scale of 7 Remake. It would take way too long, much like 7 Remake is currently doing. So to do these modern Final Fantasy remakes that are smaller scale, keep it close to how it was to the original, I think is much more doable in terms of development time, and also when you're looking at dev costs and finances. You could probably keep the cost of that development kind of low compared to 7 Remake and mainline Final Fantasies. So maybe one day 8 could get that type of remake where it's smaller scale, but they're adding voice acting, they're cleaning things up, maybe making some adjustments to that junction system. Who knows? The third option, and I don't see this happening, is Square Enix would outsource Final Fantasy VIII to a different developer to do a remake. But the last time that happened, we ended up with CyberConnect doing FF7 Remake. Square wasn't too happy with that, so they brought it back in-house. So I don't know if Square would want to loan out another Final Fantasy IP to a third-party developer. And what's really interesting is we don't know who's making FF9. We don't know what studio within Square is developing that remake, or if it's been outsourced. So it'll be interesting to see more news on that remake whenever that hits. But who knows, maybe with Square Enix getting back on track, maybe their financials and their sales numbers will start to go up a la Capcom, and maybe by the time we get to Final Fantasy VIII's 30th anniversary, maybe Square will be ready to celebrate it, give it a special new logo, new merch, some new content, and maybe a remake on the scale of what they're doing with FF9. I can dream. With that being said, that's the video. I'm Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think? Would you like to see a Final Fantasy VIII remake happen? And how would you like to see it done? Would you want it on the scale of a 7 remake, or maybe something that's smaller scale and closer to a remaster / enhanced edition? I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.